Okay, so we're going to, oh, there's a clapping your hands icon. I didn't know that, Jill. um, if you want to ask the author a question live, then you're absolutely more than welcome to. There is a raise your hand functionality. You can do it that way, or you're also welcome to enter your question in the chat window if you don't want to ask live. So please feel free to ask either way. I'm going to go ahead and ask Silvia some of the questions that have come in by email. Silvia, out of all of the, you talked about a little bit about all the stuff that you've already written, and we'd like to hear more about what you'll be writing in the future. But out of all the stuff you have written, all the books you've written and short stories, does it get easier, or is a book harder than a short piece, or can you enlighten us into that a little bit?
Yeah, it's, I mean, I used to write short stories, and during my lunch hour or something like that. So you can certainly write them quicker. When you're writing a novel, you have to string a bunch of chapters together, so you don't get that quick satisfaction of within a few weeks you have something that is done. Instead, you're just beginning a really long process. I I've never found writing to be especially like taxing or onerous. I like it. That's why I do it. I think I'm pretty decent at it. That's also why I do it. Some things get that are not related to the actual writing process, you do become used to them, and those kind of become easier. So things like learning how publicity works and what you can expect in terms of timelines, the kind of support you can expect from a publisher, the kind of things you can't expect from a publisher, and also dealing with rejection becomes easier because you're just rejected so often that it doesn't really sting anymore. You just kind of shrug it off. So in that sense, yeah, that becomes easier. In another sense, each book is just its own thing, its own book that has to undergo a certain research process and then certain writing time, and then eventually you will get it in a book. But the other parts that are kind of adjacent to writing, the publishing mechanics and things like that, have become a lot simpler. You learn acronyms when you first start writing. You probably don't know things like what's an arc, and then people throw a lot of words that you're maybe not familiar with, and after a couple of books and you pretty much know all that kind of stuff. You know who are the uh, which ones are the big outlets that are prestigious and that you're supposed to hit and all that kind of stuff. You know how to read statements for royalties, which is also kind of an art unto itself, and contracts. You learn how to read contracts and go a little bit line by line and understand some of the lingo.
I'm sure we do have lots of questions that have come in about the actual characters and the book itself. But before we dive into those, I was really hoping you could enlighten us to the process about choosing the cover, because the cover is beautiful. And a lot of people, I mean, it's very Instagram worthy, and everybody's posted it all over the Instagram because it is such a beautiful cover. So how did that process happen?
I am lucky that my editor over at Del Rey actually wanted cover input. Not every writer gets input under cover, and not every writer is consulted to the level at which I've been consulted for some things. So in this case, they asked me for ideas and visuals that I had. So I gave them basically this file that had some stuff from the 1920s and that they could look on, Art Deco things. And I talked to them about what I saw more or less in terms of what might be a good idea. And we went through it, and then they produced a first version of the cover, which had a color scheme that I told them was wrong, and that they needed to make it more vibrant. And so I gave them a palette of colors that are kind of typical of Mexico, and they looked at those, and then they come up with this final cover, which does have colors that are more suitable for for that. And we did some other small changes, like looking at the fonts and bits like that. But it's not it's not always something where you have a lot of say. Um, Sometimes you just get a cover and you have to kind of grin and bear it and live with it. And especially if it's a book with a much smaller advance and with a smaller budget, you normally just take whatever you can get. But my editor in this case did want to talk to me, both in this case and in Mexican Gothic, about what I saw and visual ideas. And I did submit a whole slew of visuals and artists that I thought might work for that. So they've been good in that sense. Um, and I think it looks pretty good. I think it captured the kind of jazz age spirit that we were looking for.
Absolutely. It's one of the most pretty covers I've seen. Um, can't we switch to audiobooks for a moment? A lot of people had listened to the audiobook. I didn't myself. I actually read it digitally and I read it the physical book, but I didn't listen to the audiobook. Um, are you narrating the audiobook?
No, the audiobook we hired narrators to do that kind of work. I was also given input for the narrator, which again is not necessarily normal. And I submitted a list of words and how the audio narrator should pronounce them. So I got to see the biography of the narrator, to listen to some audio samples, and then I sent my notes on how they should say certain words. And it was very positive, this for this and for Mexican Gothic. In previous books, for example, in Certain Dark Things, I wasn't consulted at all. I didn't ever I wasn't even given a copy of the audiobook. And then when I happened to listen to it, the young man that they hired to do that one didn't know how to speak one word of Spanish. So it didn't sound very good at all. And I was quite disappointed with that. But those books are being reissued, so there will be a new audio narrator chosen for that. And I'm pretty sure this time I can ask that they get somebody that can actually say the words.
Absolutely. That's one of the best reasons I listen to audiobooks, is so that I can actually hear them pronounced correctly. Because I have this, and I'm sure I'm the same as a lot of people, but I have this version in my head of what it like looks like, and it then when you hear somebody actually say it, you're like, oh, and then you have to connect the dots. I do have some more questions here. Ladies, if you have a question that you would like to ask live, then please feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, you can always enter it in the chat window and I'll make sure to ask. I have two more emails here, or two more questions here by email. One's from Linda. She said she loved the book. What was your inspiration? It made me want to learn more about Mexican Mayan folklore and mythology.
The direct cultural, well, no, it's not even a direct cultural source. One of the big inspirations for it is a section of the Popol Vuh, which is a written narrative of an oral story passed about the creation of the world, which is has been passed down by the Quiche Maya, and then was translated into English, and there have been several translations. And the journey into the underworld was one of the inspirations for this. In general, I really liked that book when I read it many years ago. And like I said, I've read several translations of it. The other big inspiration for it was my great grandmother. I mean, she's one of the reasons why I write always. But she was a maid and she couldn't read or write, but she would tell me stories, which I loved growing up, about her childhood, about Mexico in the time of the Revolution, about folklore. And she never, she always had to work really hard. Like I said, she was a maid. Um, and I wanted to send her on to tell a story that she might have enjoyed, and in which somebody who was a little bit like her could go on an adventure, because she never got to have much of an adventure. She always had to work since she was a teenager and take care of her child and basically take care of a family all her life, all life, all life long, and live in poverty basically. And I wanted her to be able to, somebody like her, to go on a fantastic journey, because she never got to do that.
Oh wow, that's so wonderful that it's based on her. Um, Laura asks, she said, I've read and loved three of your most recent novels and noticed that they all take place at different points in history. Gods of Jade and Shadow in the Jazz Age, Untamed Shore in the late 1970s, and Mexican Gothic in the 1950s. What draws you to a particular time in history as the backdrop for your novels?
I generally, sometimes it's like the right time period and there's no other time period for it. With Mexican Gothic, I wanted to do something that was set after mining operations in Mexico kind of have gone down by foreign powers, because I wanted to show this family that is in decay. They used to have a big bustling silver mine in Mexico. They're British. And then suddenly operations have ceased and things for them are not so good. It's this sort of twilight of the colonial empire. And mining operations ceased during the revolution, which was from 1910 to 1920. And after that, you got, the jazz age and the depression and that kind of stuff. So I didn't want to set it any time before that, because it had to be after these things have stopped. And then I didn't want to move too far into the future, into the present, for example, or, the early 2000s, because I thought that I wanted to keep a sort of historical element in the Gothic, but not set it in a Victorian time period. So 1950 became this interesting point in time where it allowed me to look both at mining operations after the revolution and both Mexico in a period of transition when it's undergoing also a lot of changes. And with Gods of Jade and Shadow, that's also the thing. It's the Jazz Age is also a big period of changes in Mexico and of conflicting forces coming together. For Untamed Shore, I remembered what the shark fishing operations were like, and then it what they're not like anymore, because you used to fish for shark pretty commonly, and now those are becoming endangered species, and a lot of things have changed in the peninsula. So if I wanted to write something that was set in the time when you're fishing for shark, I couldn't do it again in 2020, because it's just not the same kind of fishing operation. So I went back and I looked at what would be a good time period. The 70s was perfect, but I didn't want to set it too early in the 70s, because I wanted it to be after the big highway that connects the north and the south of Baja California has opened, which what might be a small detail for anybody else, but I just wanted that in there. And in 1979 ended up becoming the only year where I could set it at the end, also because of some other factors. But yeah, that became the year that was just perfect for that. So sometimes it's just that the conditions that I'm looking for are not ripe in any other time. And often it's just also curiosity. It's maybe something that I know about, but I want to know more about. I knew some things about shark fishing just from living there, but I didn't know everything. So going and actually looking at the history of shark fishing, canneries, and that kind of work in Baja California was very fun. And then I didn't end up using, I ended up using a fraction of that, but it was just a fun journey for me to kind of do back in time. And I really liked historicals in general, just, from other people. So it indulges that, I guess, that sort of organ that latches onto to things in the past.
Melise, I'm going to ask you to ask your question in a second, but before I do, I'm just going to ask Silvia, can you let us know how you do your research?
Oh, well, some are some of the stuff is primary sources that I have in my brain. So it's things from my family that I remember that we've talked about. I will sometimes just plain phone somebody and ask, do you remember X or Y? If they're still around, obviously, they're long gone. That's not an option unless you have a Ouija board. But but I do remember a lot of things that people have told me through the years and family history. So that's kind of primary sources. Secondary sources, lots of textbooks and academic papers. I am a little bit hobbled in the sense that you can pretty much get any issue of the New York Times going back more than 100 years, and you can get it online. It's pretty simple. But to get newspapers from Mexico from a certain time periods, it's basically impossible. You would have to go to the archives back there. So there's some things that I can't access so easily, but I try to get as much as I can. Other kind of academic papers that may have talked about what I'm looking at. Sometimes I have to get, well, when before the pandemic, I did use a lot of interlibrary loans so that they would send me books from the university where I work, the University of British Columbia, a lot of books from USC, from the University of Southern California. They have a really good, big Mexican collection, and that's where I get a lot of my research stuff, because here you can't just find it off the shelf or they're very expensive. So lots of academic books, lots of papers, not so many newspapers for that reason. And certain things, sometimes depending on the time period, you can even look at them in movies. So for Mexican Gothic, I could put a 1950s Mexican movie and see some of the dresses and see how they flow and how people might look like. It's not an exact representation, but it's better than nothing, same as fashion magazines. And similar things for the Jazz Age and Gods of Jade and Shadow. There were some visual records that I could look at, some silent films and things like that, that you can see not, maybe how a regular Joe lived, but certainly how something more glamorous might look like.
Thank you. Melise, I'm going to unmute you and lower your hand, and please go ahead.
Awesome. Thanks, Erin. Thanks, Sylvia, for being here. I really enjoyed the book. I especially love mythology, so I wanted to ask, could you see yourself in the future, or are you interested in writing about any other types or regions or cultures and their mythology or folklore?
I think probably not. I have so many ideas and explorations just about Mexico that I don't think that I would be going into, for example, indigenous mythology of Canada, which is where I live, just because there's so much stuff to explore within the culture that I come from. So definitely I don't have plans to do a Percy Jackson sort of thing in the future where I jump from one culture to another.
Right. I mean, it's such a rich and beautiful culture, so I'm sure you have a lot of content to work with. Thanks for answering the question.
All right. Can we talk about the fantasy genre for a minute? For those of us that don't know, excuse me, are your other books fantasy, and is that is that kind of like your wheelhouse, or do you write, or will you write in other genres?
I write in different genres. Yeah, they're not the same at all. Mexican Gothic, which just came out in June, is a Gothic novel. It's a horror novel. And in February, I released Untamed Shore, which is a noir. It's a crime. It's definitely a crime novel. There's no fantastic element to that. Next year, I've got A Dangerous Eagerness, which is another crime novel set in Mexico in 1971. There's no fantastic element. The background of that is the real life murder of student protesters in June of 1971 in Mexico City. So it changes quite a bit. And I've written science fiction, I've written stuff that is fantasy. I have a sword and sorcery novella also out next year. So each one of my books so far straddles a different category and can sometimes have a very different feel.
That's very unusual, that you write across so many different genres. Do you have a favorite?
Nope. I want to try my hand as many things as possible as I can before I die. So I would like to do a Western at some point too, and some other things that I haven't been able to do.
That's incredible. I don't think I've ever heard an author say that, to be honest. Is romance in your future?
I did write something that I would describe as a romantic fantasy novel of manners. It's called The Beautiful Ones, and it's going to be reissued next year. So that's going to come out in May again. It went out of print. And then Certain Dark Things, which is a vampire novel, is also coming back into print. So they're both going to be released in May by Tor. And they're very different books. Certain Dark Things is a gritty, violent vampire narco novel set in an alternate Mexico City. And The Beautiful Ones is this Belle Epoque inspired fantasy of manners in the vein of Henry James or something of that sort. So very different feel, very light and airy. I have not written something that is just romance without a speculative element. This one does have a small speculative element to it. So yeah, so that I haven't quite done like a pure contemporary romance or something of the sort.
What are your favorite books or authors, or what are you reading now?
I read a lot of different things because I have the column with the Washington Post. So for that, we are obviously reading a lot of fantasy and science fiction. But then in my spare time, I like to read crime novels. So I like to read a lot of noirs and some nonfiction. What I am reading right now, I'm just going to look at my Kindle, is well, this one's not out yet, but it's called Midnight Doorways: Fables from Pakistan. It's a book that I'm going to blurb, and the writer is Usman T. Malik. And so yes, he's Pakistani, so all his stories are in a fantastical vein, but they are very much set in Pakistan or inspired by that culture. At the same time, I was also reading The Acid King, which is a story, it's a true crime story about a murder. So if you like, real crime, that one is kind of interesting. And yes, and The Nicotine Chronicles, which is a bunch of stories all centered around cigarettes. Joyce Carol Oates has a story in it, which is why I bought it originally. I really like Joyce Carol Oates' work. And I bought East of Eden by Steinbeck. I don't even remember why I bought East of Eden by Steinbeck, but I did. So I guess I'm going to read it. And that's more or less what my life is like. I read very different things. I like to explore all kinds of genres. And I think if you get too in love with one single thing, you lose the capacity to have a wider perspective. So I'm always reading weird and bizarre things. Oh, here's an old novel, The Sentinel by Jeffrey Combets. I also bought that. It's a demon possession book from the 1980s. So if you like demon possession stories in a kind of old-fashioned, gory, splashy style, you can try The Sentinel.
Very good. It sounds like you don't have any time to write because you're reading too much, but you're clearly writing a lot. So what does your writing process look like?
Oh, it has changed a little bit with the pandemic. I used to write on the bus. I don't drive. I've never owned a car and I've never driven a car. So I would jump on the bus in the mornings and it's a 45-minute commute. So I would either read and, be doing research while I was on the bus and taking notes while I was doing it, or I would be, writing or working on something back and forth. And it's not very comfy in Vancouver in the winter and the fall because it rains quite a bit. But in the summer, it's actually pretty comfortable to be doing that. So that didn't happen this summer, obviously, because I'm home, and it's been a bit strange reconfiguring a routine that just seems so simple. I also work during my lunch hour. When I went to get my hamburger or my sandwich, I would work while I was doing that. And again, that the sort of freedom of you don't have to go from 12 to 1 sometimes, you know, makes it a little bit harder in a way, because now you have all this time that is just there. So that was kind of interesting. But traditionally I've just worked around my job and my children and my family, working at nights after they were put to bed when they were smaller. Now that they are, now that they're a little bit bigger, that they're teenagers, so that's not much of a problem. But they still need things like they have a physics exam and they want to go over elements or something like that, and so you got to sit down and do that with them. But yeah, normally I work late, at night, and on the bus and during whatever breaks I had at work. So with COVID-19, it's been an interesting experience because I now have that time of not commuting, so I can just wake up and theoretically do the work. But did I do it, or did I just roll back to sleep? I rolled back to sleep quite often in the beginning, and now I am waking up a little bit earlier, and packing some of that work. So yeah, I've had to be quite organized in order to do this while also doing other stuff. And when that long time process has been disrupted, it was a bit chaotic for a bit. But I've caught up. I did end up having a bigger pile of books than needed to be, especially for review and things like that, where I turned to it and I looked and I said, are there 7 books next to my bed? And it was like, well, because you haven't been reading them, Sylvia. But that's now leveled off, and I am actually doing pretty good right now. So there's only 4.
Only.
Yeah.
Shayna would like to know how involved you are in the production of Mexican Gothic for Hulu.
Well, it's, theoretically I'm an executive. Well, I have a title. It's called executive producer, but that doesn't mean that I am involved into the day-to-day stuff of that. So at some point, I will be told about certain things, but pretty much, yeah, I'm not writing it basically. They'll let me know when things are more solid. It's just starting out right now, so there's not really much to say except that they're trying to figure out a bunch of production things.
A lot of authors, when they see their work go to the big screen, get a little bit nervous. Do you have nerves around that, or are you comfortable?
Well, I don't watch television, which sounds pretty strange to say. I know that my husband says that makes you sound snotty every time you say it, but it's true. I really don't, because I'm so busy with other things, and I don't like episodic media. So I don't watch modern shows. The only thing that I've been watching this week was that I discovered that they had the Golden Girls on Amazon Prime, and I started watching some of those episodes because I remember when I went to college, they had it on reruns, and it was a very stressful time in my life, and I used to watch an episode every night, and it would make me happy. So I've been doing that, and it is making me happy. Um, but like my husband watches so many shows, and I can't understand how he does it. So in a way, because I don't know much about that world, it's okay. Just because I don't really quite understand it, and so I'm happy to let people do something where they're experts at, and I'm not an expert at it, and see what they come up with, and not be too worried about it in that sense. But also, I don't think that adaptations have to be exact duplicates of a print product. I really like Blade Runner, and if you've ever read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, they're quite different products, but they're both really good in their own way. It's a really good science fiction book, and it's a really good science fiction novel, but they're not saying the same thing. But they're both really quite magnificent. So if something gets adapted, changes have to be made to take advantage of the different medium and to fulfill the promise of that medium. But that doesn't mean that the product is flawed just because it's not exactly the same thing you read. So in that, like, I'm like, yeah, well, I'm sure it'll turn out okay, or that's what I tell myself. But yeah, no, but no, yeah, I, I'm not really that worried about it. I guess I also never thought that anybody would adapt anything of mine because any conversations that we had before this had not very been very promising. So I'm still kind of like in that limbo where it doesn't seem like it's real. It might become real, yeah, when they show me that they've cast people. But right now it's just like, oh well, that's nice to hear. You're so sweet. but but I haven't really seen anything that makes me think it's real. And that happens with TV shows too. A lot of things don't really go. They shoot the pilot, but then doesn't go into production. So I try not to get too in love with the idea of like a long running show because so many things end up, several drafts of scripts just get written and then nothing ends up really happening. So it's a nice idea. And if it ever does happen, I will sit down and watch it rather than ignore it, which is what I do with most of everything else on the TV. But for now, it's kind of sweet, but it doesn't really affect my day-to-day life.
Well, at the very least, I hope it encourages a lot of people to pick up the novel, because I know with myself, if I find out something's based on a book, then I go straight to the book first because I refuse to watch the television show before I've read the book.
Yeah, it's funny how that circular sticker that says now a major motion picture has such an impact on people, but it does. It does. You see it and then you want to be smarter than everybody else. I'm like, oh, I'm gonna read it, and then I'm gonna be witty at parties. But yeah, I've done that too. Where I've seen something and it says soon to be a major motion picture, and I'm like, well, I'll be damned. I'll read it now.
Laura has a question. She says, you mentioned that you grew up in Baja California. What part is your family from? She says she has family in La Paz. And do you get to travel back to Mexico very often?
Yeah, no, I'm from the opposite part. I'm from the north, actually. So yeah, basically, if you take the peninsula, La Paz is all the way on the other side from where I'm from. I travel sometimes, not as often as I would like to, because traveling with a family is a bit of a pickle and not that cheap. And right now with COVID, I am terrified of even looking at an airport. But I do hope that I can go next year to see some family. I have family there, and I've missed the food very much. Um, I don't go to Baja really. I go to Mexico City because I have most of my family is there. There's some people in Mexicali where I'm from, but most people are in Mexico City. I also go to Yucatan. And it's quite a beautiful country. But on the other hand, yeah, right now with COVID, it's like I we had been hoping to do this family reunion thing, and then this happened, and I'm like, I'm not going outside my house, so you guys have fun.
Okay. You must have seen the industry change so drastically over the last 10, 15 years. Do you have advice for authors wanting to get into the industry?
I guess the industry is always changing. There certainly seems to be a contraction of the mid list. It used to be that you had the big selling authors, the best selling authors, but then every publishing house had their mid list. The writers who sell but don't sell huge amounts of books, and they were the bread and butter of most companies. In the last few years, there really has been an emphasis on not paying so much attention to those mid list writers and trying to emphasize the big splashy hits right off the bat, the debuts. So this big emphasis on debuts and young people and people getting $1 million for their first book and they're 21 years old. They haven't been, the midlist allowed you to develop an audience and also to try different things, right? And this emphasis on having to be a hit right off the bat can be very bad, I think. And it certainly has left a lot of midlist authors who were pretty fine authors without much work because companies are not signing them off, not signing them on so often. Writing has always been a bit of a marathon. It's about hanging on in there. And I would say nowadays it's about hanging on in there more than ever. After the first novel, just trying to make it to the second if you can, and all that, and so forth. It takes a really long time to make a book. I mean, it takes a long time to write it, but it also takes a really long time to sometimes to get an agent, and even if you have an agent, to sell a title. So it's about learning in a way to be okay with waiting. It's most often a waiting game. Months can pass, and that kind of stuff, and not despairing. So I would say just to learn to be a little bit patient with the industry, to try to learn resilience, because that is going to be your other good skill. But trends come and go. I don't know what is going to be in the future, but right now there has definitely been this big push towards the big splashy debut, and everybody else kind of doesn't matter that much.
Thank you. I know we have some aspiring authors in the audience, so I'm sure that's really helpful to hear. Jen has just asked, this is very specific to the book that we all read as a book club. So she says, the character growth Cassiopeia undergoes throughout Gods of Jade and Shadow enables her independence, but the love she develops for, and I apologize if I don't say this correctly, Hun Kame, throughout the novel is so touching. Did you ever envision an ending where they could have been together? And I've heard this question a few times over the last 2 weeks.
No, they never ended together in my draft. Yeah, I'm sorry to say that. So that's one where you might want to woo if they ever made an adaptation of this, you might want to woo the screenwriter to make a change. But no, I never intended them to be together at the end.
Thank you. So Jen just goes on to say, it was a hot topic at book club because people wanted to see it because they were romantics, of course.
Yeah, and that's one of the problems. Sometimes people don't know about what makes a romance novel, and people who do read romance novels do know what are some of the characteristics, but other people don't. And I had somebody who was pretty upset because they told me, "Oh, my friend said that this was a romance novel, and they do not end up together at the end. What is this bullshit?" And I was like, "I'm so sorry. I guess your friend doesn't know what the romance category entails, and that there's supposed to be a happily ever after." And I mean, they still ended up liking the book, but they were just like, "I was promised a romance, and this was a lie." I was crying, and at the end, I was like, "I'm so sorry." It's just it's not. If you look at the BISA code, it doesn't say romance on it.
I thought the end was very satisfying personally, so I didn't have a problem that they didn't end up together. Laura has a comment. She just says, the red flowers in the underworld that showed up was a lovely touch.
Okay, good. It was not total heartbreak.
Thank you so much for joining us. Our last question for you this evening is, what can we look forward to?
Yeah, well, as I already mentioned, I got a lot of books out next year, just because I've got 2 reissues, and then I've got a new original crime novel, and then I've got a sword and sorcery novella, and they all sort of coalesced around the same time. So that's exactly for 2021. It's like a lot of different things. So if you don't like violent vampire books, then maybe you can try fantasy, and there's a lot of stuff to choose from. And
Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me because I can't hear anything.
in 2022, it released The Daughter of Dr. Moreau. Yep. So that's it. I think my connection is a little bit unstable, but I hope I can say goodbye and everybody can hear me.
We can hear you again. We did lose you there for a moment, I think, but thank you
Okay.
so much. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for writing such a brilliant book. We only read one fantasy a year, so I'm very, very pleased it was yours. And thank you for taking the time to speak with us tonight. And I apologize I was late.
No, thank you. Thanks everybody for taking the time to chat with me. And good luck. I hope you have a happy reading in October, whatever book you're reading.
Thank you. Good night, ladies. Thanks for joining, everybody. I hope you have a good evening.
Goodbye.